My HOA chainsawed my memorial garden for a magazine photo. I woke up Tuesday morning to find 3 years of work gone. Hedge wall destroyed, memorial roses for my 3 fallen Afghan buddies scattered like roadkill. Some HOA princess and her crew had turned it into sawdust for their magazine photo shoot. The diesel exhaust from their wood chipper still hung in the morning air like a war zone. I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, staring at the destruction. Most people would call lawyers, file complaints, beg bureaucrats for justice. But I'm a Navy Seabee. We don't beg, we build. And when someone declares war on sacred ground, you don't rebuild a hedge wall. You build a fortress that'll make them wish they'd never heard your name. What would you do if your HOA destroyed your memorial to fallen heroes? Where are you watching from? Dealing with HOA nightmares too? Let me paint you the picture of Paradise Pines, one of those upscale suburban developments where every mailbox costs more than most people's monthly rent. The kind of place where the grass gets measured with rulers, and God forbid your garbage can stays out past 7 a.m. on collection day. I'm Earl Morrison, but everybody calls me Tank, nickname stuck from my Navy Seabee days when I could weld a hull patch in 30-foot swells. Spent 22 years building bridges, runways, and forward operating bases in places that would make your GPS cry. These days I run a small welding shop out of my garage, fabricating custom ironwork for folks who appreciate real craftsmanship. The metallic ping of cooling steel from my evening welding sessions had become the soundtrack of my new life. Better than the sound of lawyers arguing over who gets what, that's for sure. Now, I ended up in Paradise Pines through what you might call divorce mathematics. Wife got the big house in town, the nice cars, half my pension. I got this corner lot and a monthly alimony payment that keeps my ramen budget tight. But you know what? After 18 months of marriage counseling and legal fees, this little third of an acre plot was exactly what I needed. The property sits right at the main entrance. Prime real estate that the original developer probably marked for a fancy fountain or some such nonsense. Instead, they sold it to me for a fraction of market value because it had sightline challenges. Translation, it was wedged between a retention pond and a utility easement where normal people couldn't build their dream McMansion. Perfect for a guy who just wanted to be left alone. My morning routine had become sacred, coffee on the front porch, listening to the distant hum of the community's irrigation system, watching the sunrise paint everything golden. Simple pleasures for a guy who'd spent 2 decades in places where sunrise meant checking for incoming mortars. I spent 3 years turning that corner lot into something special. Not fancy. I'm not trying to compete with these folks and their $80,000 landscaping budgets, but honest work. A small workshop, a vegetable garden, and most importantly, a living wall of mixed hedge, privet, holly, and Carolina cherry laurel that I'd babied through 2 drought summers and 1 ice storm that took down half the county's power lines. The earthy smell of compost and fresh mulch from my weekend gardening routine had replaced the scent of diesel and cordite that used to follow me everywhere. Healing, one Saturday morning at a time. Those hedges weren't just plants. They were my first successful growing project since the divorce. See, for 22 years in the Navy, everything I built was steel and concrete, stuff that lasted because it was engineered to last. Plants? Plants require patience, faith that tomorrow's sun will come, belief that small daily efforts add up to something beautiful. Every Saturday morning I'd walk that hedge line with my coffee, checking for new growth, pruning dead branches, just taking inventory. The satisfying click-snip of my pruning shears had become meditation. My neighbors probably thought I was obsessive. Truth was, watching those hedges thrive helped me believe maybe I could thrive too. Enter Genevieve Sterling Cross, HOA Architectural Review Committee Chair and self-appointed guardian of Paradise Pines, visual harmony. Picture every HOA horror story you've heard, then add an interior design degree, a bankruptcy attorney husband, and the kind of smile that makes you check your wallet. Genevieve drives a pearl white Lexus SUV that's never seen dirt, wears tennis outfits to grocery shop, and has the unique talent of making "how lovely" sound like a death threat. She's also got very specific opinions about which residents fit the community vision and which ones represent transitional demographics. Guess which category includes divorced Navy vets who drive 12-year-old pickup trucks? I should have seen it coming when she started showing up at board meetings with poster board presentations about entrance aesthetics and property value optimization. But I was naive. I figured live and let live. My hedges weren't hurting anybody, and technically my property taxes helped pay for her precious community newsletter. That Tuesday morning changed everything. I woke up at 0630 hours like always, old habits from 2 decades of military reveille. Poured my coffee, stepped onto the front porch, and stopped dead. My hedge wall was gone, not trimmed, not damaged, gone. Chainsawed down to 6-inch stumps with the debris piled into a burn pile like some kind of botanical funeral pyre. 3 guys in Paradise Pines landscaping uniforms were loading the last of my cherry laurel branches into a wood chipper that sounded like a chainsaw having a nervous breakdown. The crew chief, a sunburned guy named Miguel, looked as confused as I felt. "Sorry, sir. We got work order from HOA office. Says emergency removal, sightline violation." He handed me a crumpled work order signed by Genevieve herself. "Remove hedge obstruction at lot 47 for community beautification project." Here's what that work order didn't mention. Underneath that hedge wall, I'd planted memorial roses. 3 bushes, 1 for each buddy I lost in Afghanistan. Rodriguez, Smith, Williams, guys who never made it home to worry about HOA violations. The landscaping crew had ripped them out too. Didn't even know they were there. I stood in my front yard holding a coffee mug, staring at torn rose roots scattered in the dirt, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger. Anger burns hot and fades fast. This was calculation. Strategic assessment. The kind of calm that comes over you when someone just made a very expensive mistake. First step, reconnaissance. I grabbed my camera and started documenting everything. The work order, the crew, the license plate on their truck, GPS timestamps on every photo. 22 years of military training teaches you that wars are won with paperwork as much as firepower. Here's something most people don't know. When documenting property damage, always photograph with GPS timestamps enabled on your phone. Digital evidence with location data holds up better in court than regular photos. Then I called the HOA office, got voicemail, left a message that probably used language inappropriate for a family-friendly story. Next call, Paradise Pines Landscaping. Talked to the owner, Carlos Mendez, decent guy who'd actually done some ironwork subcontracting for my shop. "Man, Tank, I'm sorry. We just follow the work orders. But hey, this one was weird. Rush job, paid cash up front, and the lady seemed real specific about doing it today while you were supposedly out of town." Interesting. Someone had been watching my schedule. Oh, and Tank, they had a photographer there the whole time. Professional setup, big camera, reflectors, the works. Kept telling us to position the chipper for better angles. That's when the pieces clicked together. This wasn't random HOA enforcement. This was a planned photo shoot, using my property as their backdrop without permission. Destruction of private property for commercial purposes. I remember Genevieve bragging at the last community meeting about some photographer coming to shoot the community entrance experience for a magazine feature. Paradise Pines had been trying to get featured in Southern Living for 3 years. They'd turned my hedge into their scenic shot, used my memorial roses as mulch for their magazine spread. 3 days later, the salt in the wound arrived by certified mail. Notice of architectural compliance achievement. They were actually congratulating me for the improvement to my property and suggesting I consider complementary entrance landscaping that aligns with community standards. The letter included a helpful brochure for approved plants, all available through Sterling Cross Design Services, naturally, and a quote for professional installation, $8,500. But the real kicker was the last paragraph. Please note that any unauthorized structures or landscaping installed without Architectural Review Committee approval will be subject to immediate removal and associated fees. That letter told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about sightlines or community standards. This was about control and profit. Genevieve had destroyed my hedges to create a problem, then positioned herself as the expensive solution. Meanwhile, my insurance company delivered their own bad news. Landscaping and plantings are not covered under standard homeowners policies unless specifically added as a rider. Translation: I was out $3,000 worth of mature plants and 5 years of labor. Time for some strategic intelligence gathering. I started attending HOA board meetings, something I'd avoided for 3 years because life's too short for that kind of bureaucratic theater. Turns out I'd been missing quite a show. Genevieve ran those meetings like her personal kingdom, with a Robert's Rules of Order manual she wielded like a scepter. The sound of her gavel hitting the table had the sharp crack of authority wielded by someone who'd never earned it. But more importantly, I learned about the Paradise Pines Beautification Initiative, a $200,000 project funded by a special assessment that would enhance property values through strategic landscaping improvements. Guess who won the landscaping contract? Sterling Cross Design Services. Guess who owns Sterling Cross Design Services? Genevieve's company. Guess who voted to approve the contract? The same board that approved destroying my hedges. The game was rigged from the start. But here's where my Navy intelligence training paid off. I requested copies of all board meeting minutes from the past year. Public record, can't legally refuse. Buried in the October minutes, I found this gem. Motion to designate Lot 47 as Community Gateway Enhancement Zone for purposes of beautification project coordination. Motion carries 4-1. They'd rezoned my property without notifying me, made it subject to community enhancement without my knowledge or consent. The hedge destruction wasn't vandalism. In their twisted logic, it was legitimate municipal action, except for one small problem. They'd done it in a closed session without public notice, which violated state open meeting laws. Most people don't realize that HOA boards are subject to the same transparency requirements as city councils. Any vote affecting individual property rights must be conducted in open session with advance notice to affected parties. I'd found their first legal vulnerability. 2 weeks later, Genevieve escalated. I came home from the hardware store to find an orange violation notice stapled to my front door. Unapproved storage of building materials in residential zone. The building materials? 6 shipping containers I'd just purchased from a surplus dealer in Jacksonville. They were sitting in my driveway, exactly where the delivery truck had dropped them, waiting for me to figure out where to position them permanently. The violation notice gave me 72 hours to remove the containers or face daily fines of $200. But here's the catch. Moving 6 40-foot shipping containers isn't something you do with a pickup truck and good intentions. Professional transport runs about $400 per container, plus crane rental for placement. Genevieve knew I couldn't afford $2,400 in moving costs on short notice. She was trying to force me into violation status, which would give the HOA legal grounds to place a lien on my property. Instead of moving the containers, I did something unexpected. I called the county building department and applied for a construction permit. "What are you building, sir?" "Architectural landscape screening structure, mixed materials, incorporating recycled shipping containers as structural elements." Turns out, there's no county ordinance against using shipping containers for landscaping purposes, as long as they're properly positioned and don't violate setback requirements. And since my property sits on a corner lot with weird dimensional angles, I had plenty of room to work. But the real genius move? I scheduled the permit inspection for the same day as the HOA's next board meeting. Public notice required. While researching container placement regulations, I discovered something beautiful. My property deed included an agricultural use grandfather clause from when this land was farmland. As long as I maintained some productive agricultural activity, I was exempt from certain HOA architectural restrictions. Time to plant a vegetable garden. But not just any garden. I designed a permaculture food forest that would require protective structural elements to shield delicate plants from wind and traffic pollution. Elements like, say, strategically positioned shipping containers. The sweet smell of irony was better than any fertilizer. I also learned that shipping containers, when properly anchored, are considered temporary structures under county code, meaning I could position them without permanent foundation work and move them later if needed. Here's a key insight for anyone dealing with HOA overreach. Research your local building codes before making any modifications. Temporary structures often have completely different approval requirements than permanent construction. The plan was forming. Instead of replacing the hedge wall, I'd build something the HOA couldn't destroy. Something that would block their precious sight lines while staying completely within legal boundaries. Most importantly, I'd build something that would make them very, very sorry they'd started this war. At the next board meeting, Genevieve tried to rally support for emergency container removal. She stood at her podium, pointing to enlarged photos of my driveway like she was presenting evidence at a war crimes tribunal. These industrial eyesores represent everything we've worked to prevent in Paradise Pines. Property values, aesthetic harmony, community standards, all threatened by one resident's selfish disregard for our collective vision. The dramatic pause after collective vision was pure theater. You could practically hear the violins. But when she opened the floor for community input, 3 residents stood up with their own stories. Mrs. Peterson from Magnolia Drive, forced to remove her butterfly garden because it wasn't architecturally consistent. Mr. Kim from Oak Street, fined for parking his work van in his own driveway because it was commercial vehicle storage. Dorothy from across the street, cited for hanging laundry outside because it created visual clutter. A pattern was emerging. Genevieve wasn't just targeting me, she was systematically harassing anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of community standards. The meeting ended with no action taken on my containers, but I could see the wheels turning behind Genevieve's smile. She was planning something bigger. I just had to make sure I was ready when she pulled the trigger. Genevieve's next move was predictably escalatory. She hired Bradford Mitchell and Associates, the kind of attorney firm that specializes in crushing individual property owners with expensive legal process. They sent me a cease and desist letter demanding immediate container removal and threatening litigation for willful property devaluation of surrounding homes. The letterhead alone probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, but her nuclear option was filing an emergency complaint with the county claiming my containers violated residential aesthetic standards and posed a traffic safety hazard because they blocked driver sight lines. She also contacted the state environmental office claiming I was operating an illegal salvage yard in a residential zone, complete with photos taken from various angles to make 6 neat shipping containers look like a junkyard. The legal pressure was real. Even frivolous lawsuits cost money to defend, and attorneys like Bradford Mitchell don't bill in small numbers. I was looking at potential legal fees that could exceed my annual income. Worse, they'd filed for a temporary restraining order that would freeze any further construction on my property until the courts resolved their complaint. If granted, I couldn't complete the maze or install the final components. Time to play my first major card. I contacted the county environmental office myself and provided copies of something Genevieve didn't know I had, the 1987 buffer zone designation, along with documentation that my containers were environmental screening structures designed to protect the designated natural area from road pollution. I also filed counter-complaints. The HOA's fountain constituted unauthorized construction in a protected environmental zone. Their photo shoots violated federal wetland regulations. That retention pond was technically classified as a stormwater management facility, and their landscape destruction violated county environmental protection ordinances. Translation: for every legal action they filed against me, I filed 3 against them, but the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carlos from Paradise Pines Landscaping called me with urgent information. Tank man, I can't be part of this. She approached me about sabotaging your container installation. Wanted me to accidentally damage your containers during a routine landscape maintenance operation. Make it look like equipment malfunction. Insurance would cover replacement costs. The conversation had been eating at Carlos for weeks. He'd actually recorded it on his phone. Smart guy knew something wasn't right about the whole situation. I got kids, Tank. I can't be involved in destroying people's property for some rich lady's grudges. She was planning to destroy my containers the same way she'd destroyed my hedges, with plausible deniability and insurance complications. But Carlos had handed me something precious. Evidence that Genevieve wasn't just abusing HOA authority, she was actively planning felony destruction of property. Conspiracy to commit property destruction, on audio, with clear criminal intent. Here's something most people don't understand about property disputes. Documentation of intent transforms civil violations into criminal cases. Always keep records of any conversations where someone threatens or plans property damage. Meanwhile, I was making progress on the containers themselves. Each one was positioned at calculated angles, creating what looked like an industrial art installation from the main road. But the real genius was in the details I was still welding into place. The maze design used principles from military-based security, multiple choke points, clear sight lines for monitoring, and controlled access that could be modified based on threat level. Each container was positioned to maximize wind resistance and minimize maintenance requirements. More importantly, I was creating a one-way system. You could drive in following what would look like visitor parking signs, but the pathway narrowed progressively. By the time you realized you were trapped, you'd pass 3 points of no return. The exit mechanism was beautiful in its simplicity, a weighted gate system triggered by vehicle pressure. Drive onto the pressure plate, and counterweights would swing the entry gate closed behind you. The only way out was through the far end, which I deliberately made too narrow for any vehicle larger than a golf cart. The sound of steel on steel as I welded the counterweight system into place was music to my ears. Each spark that flew was another piece of justice being forged. During this construction phase, I had an unexpected visitor. Dorothy from across the street brought fresh coffee and some interesting information that would change everything. Tank, honey, I've been watching this whole drama with your hedges, and I think you should know something about your property line. Dorothy had been in Paradise Pines since day one, back when it was just dirt roads and surveyor stakes. She remembered when the developer was planning lot layouts, and she'd kept copies of the original plat maps. Your corner lot? It's not actually corner-shaped. Look at this. She spread out a 1987 survey map showing property boundaries before Paradise Pines existed. What she showed me would turn this entire conflict upside down. But that discovery deserves its own chapter in this story. Dorothy's survey map was like finding buried treasure. My lot extended 12 feet further toward the main road than anyone realized, including Genevieve. The community entrance where she'd been staging her photo shoots was actually on my property. But that wasn't the best part. The original environmental impact study required for the development permit designated my entire lot as a natural buffer zone between residential areas and the main highway. That designation came with special protections. Any changes to existing vegetation or natural screening required county approval and 30-day public notice. Genevieve's crew had violated federal environmental regulations when they destroyed my hedges. And since Paradise Pines was built using federal infrastructure grants, that violation could trigger a compliance review of the entire development. Dorothy, you're telling me the HOA has been trespassing on my property for 5 years? Honey, that's not even the best part. You see that retention pond, the one their fancy fountain sits in? According to these maps, that's on your land too. The fountain, the centerpiece of their precious community entrance experience. The same fountain featured in every Paradise Pines marketing photo and HOA newsletter. The fountain that Genevieve had spent $40,000 of community funds to install. It was on my property, without my permission, without easement paperwork. I now owned the HOA's most valuable asset, and they didn't even know it. Better yet, as owner of the natural buffer zone, I had legal authority to install appropriate environmental screening structures to protect the area from road pollution and noise. Structures like shipping containers, structures that didn't require HOA approval because they fell under county environmental protection guidelines. The law wasn't just on my side, it was actively working against them. Dorothy pulled out another document, the original development agreement with the county. Paradise Pines had received tax incentives and infrastructure grants based on maintaining natural buffer zones and environmental screening areas throughout the development. Tank, if they'd been violating the environmental protection requirements, the county could revoke their development status and demand repayment of those grants. We're talking about millions of dollars. And the scope of Genevieve's mistake was starting to sink in. She hadn't just destroyed my hedges. She'd potentially jeopardized the legal foundation of the entire development. I could demand immediate restoration of the buffer zone vegetation, force removal of the unauthorized fountain, and charge the HOA back rent for 5 years of trespassing. At fair market rates for prime entrance property, that was easily $50,000. Or I could let them keep the fountain for a monthly easement fee that would make their board meetings very interesting. The power dynamic had completely shifted. I wasn't some isolated homeowner fighting an HOA anymore. I was a property owner whose land rights had been systematically violated by an organization that had overstepped their authority in ways that could bankrupt them. But I decided to keep this information quiet until the perfect moment. In military strategy, you don't reveal your strongest position until you're ready to use it for maximum effect. The law was on my side, the evidence was documented, and my trap was nearly complete. Time to finish building my fortress and wait for Genevieve to walk into it. Over the next 3 weeks, I transformed those 6 shipping containers into something Paradise Pines would never forget. But this wasn't random construction. This was engineered psychological warfare. The positioning was everything. From the main road, it looked like an industrial art installation. Rusted steel barriers that completely blocked their precious scenic vista. But visitors following my deliberately placed community parking signs would find themselves in a progressively narrowing funnel system. I welded the containers together at specific angles, creating what appeared to be a simple entrance pathway. The genius was in the details. By the time you realized the path was too narrow to turn around, you'd passed 3 points of no return. The mechanical systems took 2 weeks to perfect. The entry gate operated on a weighted counterbalance. Drive onto the pressure plate, and physics did the rest. Your vehicle's weight would trigger a mechanism that swung the entry gate closed behind you, held in place by a series of counterweights I'd salvaged from old garage door systems. The satisfying clunk of that gate closing was pure poetry. I tested it dozens of times with my pickup truck, adjusting the sensitivity until it triggered at exactly the right moment. Each welding session filled the evening air with the sharp scent of hot metal and possibility. Every spark that flew was another piece of justice being forged into place. For the legal strategy, I consulted with a property law attorney using my VA benefits. Best $400 I ever spent. I learned that my grandfather clause and buffer zone status gave me extraordinary protection, but only if I documented everything properly. I filed formal complaints with the county about unauthorized construction on my property, violation of environmental protection zones, and illegal destruction of protected vegetation. Each complaint triggered automatic review processes that would take months to resolve. Here's something most people don't know about government bureaucracy. Once you file an environmental protection complaint, it creates a legal freeze on any related property modifications until the review is complete. Translation: the HOA would be tied up in regulatory paperwork until spring, with no legal standing to challenge my container installation. The financial calculation was beautiful. The entire operation cost me $3,200, 6 surplus containers at $400 each, crane rental for positioning at $800, welding supplies and hardware at $600, and legal consultation at $400. Compare that to Genevieve's $8,500 landscaping quote, and I was looking at 60% cost savings for something that would never need watering, pruning, or replacement. But the real financial leverage came from my property survey discovery. I could charge the HOA $200 per month for fountain easement rights, retroactive 5 years. That's $12,000 in back payments, plus ongoing revenue. Dorothy became my intelligence asset, attending board meetings and reporting back on Genevieve's increasingly frantic attempts to find legal ways to force container removal. Apparently, she'd hired 3 different attorneys and gotten the same advice. I was operating completely within my rights. 2 other original residents, both dealing with their own HOA harassment, offered support and documentation of similar violation patterns. Mrs. Peterson brought photographs of her destroyed butterfly garden. Mr. Kim provided copies of his commercial vehicle citations for parking his plumbing van in his own driveway. Carlos from Paradise Pines Landscaping quietly provided information about other rush jobs Genevieve had commissioned, including destroying a vegetable garden that violated ornamental landscaping requirements and removing a children's playset that created visual clutter. The pattern was clear: systematic harassment targeting anyone who didn't fit her aesthetic vision. The technical beauty of shipping container construction is that it's modular and reversible. Unlike permanent structures, containers can be repositioned without damaging property or requiring foundation work. This gave me legal protection as a temporary installation while creating the visual impact of a permanent fortress. The maze design incorporated lessons from every forward operating base I'd helped construct: controlled access points, clear sight lines for monitoring, and multiple contingency options. Each container was positioned to maximize wind resistance and minimize maintenance requirements. I spent the final week installing security cameras, technically for agricultural security to protect my vegetable garden, and testing the gate mechanism repeatedly. Everything had to work perfectly on the first try because you don't get a second chance at psychological warfare. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Let Genevieve drive into the maze during one of her client tours, trigger the trap, and then offer to discuss property easement negotiations while she was literally trapped in my shipping container fortress. The timeline was perfect. The HOA's quarterly meeting was scheduled for December 15th, when they traditionally conducted community tours for prospective buyers. Genevieve always brought her real estate clients through the main entrance to show off the fountain and maintained entrance aesthetics. This time they'd get a very different kind of tour. Genevieve's desperation was becoming obvious. She filed an emergency county complaint claiming my containers violated residential aesthetic standards and posed a traffic safety hazard because they blocked driver sight lines. She also contacted the state environmental office claiming I was operating an illegal salvage yard in a residential zone, complete with photos taken from various angles to make 6 neat shipping containers look like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Her photography skills were impressive. She'd managed to capture shadows and angles that made my engineered installation look like a tornado had dropped random debris in my yard. The nuclear option was hiring Bradford, Mitchell & Associates to send me a cease and desist letter threatening litigation for willful property devaluation of surrounding homes. They also filed for a temporary restraining order that would freeze any further construction on my property until the courts resolved their complaint. The legal pressure was real. Even frivolous lawsuits cost money to defend, and attorneys like Bradford Mitchell bill in numbers that would make a defense contractor blush. I was looking at potential legal fees that could exceed my annual income. But here's where my counter strategy paid off. For every legal action they filed against me, I'd already filed 3 against them: environmental violations, unauthorized construction in protected zones, illegal destruction of federally protected vegetation. I'd turned their legal assault into a bureaucratic nightmare for them. The county environmental office was very interested in my documentation that the HOA had violated buffer zone protections. Turns out, destroying established vegetation in a designated environmental area triggers automatic compliance reviews that can affect an entire development's federal grant status. Then Carlos called with information that changed everything. Tank, I can't keep quiet about this anymore. Genevieve approached me last week about sabotaging your container setup. She wanted me to accidentally damage them during a routine landscape maintenance operation, make it look like equipment malfunction so insurance would cover the replacement costs. My blood ran cold. She was planning to destroy my containers the same way she'd destroyed my hedges, with plausible deniability and financial cover. I recorded the whole conversation on my phone, man. I got kids to think about. I can't be part of destroying people's property for some rich lady's personal vendetta. Carlos had handed me a gift. Audio evidence of conspiracy to commit felony property destruction. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was criminal intent, documented and prosecutable. She offered me $5,000 in cash to make your containers accidentally get damaged beyond repair. Said it had to look like normal wear and tear from moving heavy equipment around. The recording was crystal clear. Genevieve's voice discussing payment schedules, damage scenarios, and insurance claim procedures. She'd essentially hired Carlos to commit a felony on her behalf. Here's something most property owners don't realize. When someone plans intentional damage to your property, it transforms a civil dispute into a criminal case with much more serious consequences. Documentation is everything. I made copies of Carlos's recording and delivered them to the sheriff's office, the county attorney's office, and my own attorney. Conspiracy to commit property destruction is a felony in most states, carrying potential jail time and automatic disqualification from holding HOA board positions. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening in the community. Dorothy reported that 3 more neighbors had approached her with their own Genevieve horror stories. Apparently, my container installation had given other residents the courage to speak up about their own harassment experiences. Mrs. Patterson from Elm Street, forced to remove solar panels because they weren't architecturally harmonious. Mr. Rodriguez from Pine Avenue, fined repeatedly for having his elderly mother's wheelchair ramp visible from the street. The Johnsons from Maple Court, threatened with liens for growing vegetables in their front yard instead of ornamental plants. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Genevieve wasn't enforcing community standards. She was systematically targeting residents who didn't fit her narrow vision of suburban perfection. Dorothy had been busy organizing these families, documenting their experiences, and preparing a comprehensive complaint to the state HOA Oversight Board. Turns out, systematic harassment based on economic status or lifestyle choices violates federal fair housing regulations. The smell of justice was starting to overpower the scent of Genevieve's expensive perfume. But her final desperate move was the most revealing. She organized an emergency community meeting to rally support against my industrial eyesore and its negative impact on property values. The meeting was scheduled for December 14th, one day before the quarterly board meeting and prospective buyer tours. Perfect timing for my trap. Genevieve stood before a packed community center presenting enlarged photographs of my container installation like evidence in a criminal trial. Her PowerPoint presentation was titled, "Protecting Paradise Pines, When Individual Actions Threaten Community Values." But when she opened the floor for community input, something beautiful happened. One by one, residents stood up to share their own stories of HOA harassment. The meeting she'd organized to destroy me had become a public forum for exposing her systematic abuse of power. The tide was turning. My fortress was complete. The legal groundwork was laid. Time for the final act. Genevieve's final overreach was perfectly orchestrated desperation. She scheduled what she called a Property Values Impact Assessment Tour for December 15th, bringing 3 prospective real estate clients to prove that my containers hadn't actually affected home values in the community. The irony was delicious. She was literally bringing customers to witness her own downfall. Her plan was transparent. Parade wealthy buyers past my eyesore, document their negative reactions, then use those reactions as evidence in court that my installation was causing measurable financial damage to the community. She'd even hired a professional real estate appraiser to provide expert testimony about the visual impact of industrial structures on residential property values. The whole operation was being documented by a videographer she'd brought from her design company. But I knew something Genevieve didn't. Her tour route would take them directly through my container maze entrance, following the community parking signs I'd strategically placed to funnel traffic exactly where I wanted it. The morning of December 15th dawned crisp and clear. Perfect weather for a reckoning. I positioned myself in a lawn chair on my front porch with a cup of coffee and a clear view of the entrance to my maze. The security cameras I'd installed were recording everything, and Dorothy had discreetly contacted the local news station about a developing HOA story that might interest them. The county building inspector was scheduled to arrive at 10:30 for a routine compliance check on my environmental screening installation. Timing is everything in military operations. At 10:15, Genevieve's pearl-white Lexus SUV appeared, followed by a silver Mercedes sedan carrying her real estate clients. The appraiser brought up the rear in a black BMW, and the videographer rode shotgun in Genevieve's vehicle with professional camera equipment clearly visible. They followed my visitor parking this way signs perfectly, turning into the container maze entrance exactly as designed. From my porch, I could see Genevieve gesturing toward my installation while speaking animatedly to her passengers. The genius of the maze design became apparent as they progressed through the narrowing pathway. By the time Genevieve realized the route was becoming too narrow to turn around, she'd passed the point of no return. I watched her brake lights flash as she tried to reverse, but the Mercedes behind her was too close, and the pathway curved just enough to prevent backing up safely. They were committed to moving forward through progressively tighter clearances. The sweet sound of expensive metal scraping against rusty container walls was like a symphony. Nothing serious, just enough contact to make backing up impossible without significant paint damage. Then came the beautiful moment. Genevieve's SUV triggered the pressure plate mechanism, and the counterweight system activated with a satisfying clang. The entry gate swung closed behind the Mercedes, trapping all three vehicles in my container fortress. The exit path ahead was deliberately narrow, designed for golf carts, not luxury vehicles. They were stuck until someone with a crane could extract them. I sat in my lawn chair, sipping coffee, watching Genevieve's perfect hair become increasingly disheveled as she realized her situation. Her muffled shouting from inside the SUV was barely audible, but her gestures were universally comprehensible. That's when the county inspector arrived, followed immediately by the local news crew Dorothy had alerted. Then came the sheriff's deputy responding to what dispatch would later describe as residents trapped in metal structure. But the most beautiful arrival was Genevieve's attorney husband, Bradford Mitchell himself, who'd driven separately to provide legal intimidation during the property tour. His black Porsche followed the same visitor parking signs and triggered the same trap mechanism. Now I had 4 vehicles trapped in my maze, including 2 attorneys, 3 potential real estate buyers, 1 appraiser, 1 videographer, and the woman who destroyed my memorial roses. Time for my mic drop moment. I stood up from my lawn chair, walked to the edge of my property line, and spread out Dorothy's 1987 survey maps for everyone to see. The news cameras were rolling, the county inspector was taking notes, and the sheriff's deputy was documenting everything for his report. "Welcome to my land," I called out, my voice carrying easily across the container courtyard. "That fountain you've been showing off to buyers? It's on my property. Has been for 5 years. No easement, no permission, no rent paid." I held up the environmental protection documents. "This entire area is designated as a federal buffer zone. Destroying my hedges violated environmental regulations that could affect your development grants." Then I pulled out my phone and played Carlos's recording of Genevieve's sabotage conspiracy for everyone to hear. The silence from inside those trapped vehicles was profound. Fire department arrived 20 minutes later with a crane truck, but extraction would take hours. Plenty of time for photos, interviews, and official documentation of everything that had led to this moment. Justice, properly engineered and perfectly executed. The fire department crane truck arrived with sirens wailing, drawing every neighbor within a half-mile radius to witness the spectacle. Captain Rodriguez, no relation to my fallen buddy, surveyed the situation with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of extracting people from their own bad decisions. "Sir, we're going to need to lift these vehicles straight up and out. This is going to take some time." Perfect. Time was exactly what I needed for this to unfold properly. The news crew had positioned themselves for optimal footage of luxury vehicles being crane lifted from a rusty container maze. The image was going to be worth 1,000 words about HOA overreach. County Inspector Williams was documenting everything with methodical precision. "Mr. Morrison, I need to verify the legal status of this installation." I handed him copies of my construction permit, the environmental buffer zone designation, the agricultural exemption paperwork, and the original 1987 property survey. "Everything's properly permitted. These containers are classified as temporary environmental screening structures protecting the designated natural buffer area." "And the fountain?" "Unauthorized construction on my property. No permits, no easement agreement, no rent paid for 5 years. Inspector Williams walked the property line with his measuring tape, comparing the survey maps to the actual fountain location. "This is clearly on your land, Mr. Morrison. The HOA will need to remove it or negotiate easement rights with you." That's when Sheriff's Deputy Martinez approached with Carlos's audio recording queued up on my phone. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you about some allegations." Through the closed windows of her trapped SUV, Genevieve was frantically making phone calls, probably trying to reach attorneys who weren't currently trapped in container mazes. The real estate buyers were documenting everything with their phones, but not for the reasons Genevieve had intended. Instead of filming evidence of property damage, they were capturing the story of their own imprisonment by an HOA board member's illegal schemes. "This is insane," one of them called out. "We were told this was a property value assessment, not some kind of revenge trap." Dorothy appeared with a tray of coffee and bottled water for the crowd that had gathered. "Tank, honey, you want me to offer refreshments to your guests?" The absurdity of serving coffee to people trapped in a shipping container maze was not lost on anyone present. The news reporter was already crafting the lead story in her head. As the crane operator began positioning his equipment, I decided it was time for my prepared statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the media, county officials, and trapped visitors," I began, projecting my voice clearly for the cameras. "What you're witnessing here is the result of systematic HOA harassment that destroyed my memorial garden dedicated to fallen service members." I held up photographs of my original hedge wall and the memorial roses underneath. Genevieve Sterling Cross ordered the destruction of these plants without warning, without permission, and without legal authority. She then attempted to profit from the damage by charging me $8,500 for replacement landscaping through her own company. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Nothing gets people's attention like a good David versus Goliath story. But the real crime was discovered when she approached a local landscaping contractor to sabotage my legal container installation through deliberate equipment damage. I held up the phone with Carlos's recording. "Conspiracy to commit felony property destruction. Documented and recorded." Deputy Martinez nodded grimly. Conspiracy charges were serious business. "Furthermore," I continued, "investigation of HOA records revealed that the board illegally rezoned my property without notification, violated state open meeting laws, and constructed an unauthorized fountain on my land using community funds." Inspector Williams was taking notes furiously. Each violation I mentioned would require separate investigation and potential penalties. As the crane began lifting Genevieve's SUV from the maze, she finally rolled down her window. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. "This is harassment. You can't just trap people on your property." "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez called up to the suspended vehicle, "you're on his property without permission. That makes this trespassing, not harassment." The crane slowly rotated her SUV over the container walls and lowered it to the street beyond my property line. As soon as the wheels touched asphalt, she gunned the engine and disappeared down the road without looking back. The Mercedes carrying her clients was extracted next, followed by the appraiser's BMW. Each passenger emerged looking shell-shocked and thoroughly documented by the news cameras. But Bradford Mitchell's Porsche presented a special problem. As the crane lifted his expensive sports car, oil began dripping from what appeared to be a damaged transmission pan. "Looks like your vehicle scraped the container edge pretty good," Captain Rodriguez observed. "You'll want to have that checked before driving." The poetic justice was almost too perfect. The attorney who'd threatened to sue me for property damage now had actual property damage from his own illegal trespassing. Justice, served with a side of transmission fluid. The aftermath unfolded like a perfectly executed military operation. Within 48 hours, Genevieve had resigned her HOA position to pursue other opportunities. Bradford Mitchell's law firm dropped their case and issued a formal apology for misunderstanding the legal complexities of the situation. The emergency HOA board meeting that followed was standing room only. Dorothy had organized 23 families with documentation of similar harassment, and the new interim board spent 4 hours listening to testimony about systematic abuse targeting residents who didn't fit Genevieve's vision of suburban perfection. My container maze became the unlikely catalyst for complete HOA reform. The financial settlement exceeded my wildest expectations. The board agreed to pay $15,000 in damages for the hedge destruction and memorial roses, plus all my legal fees and construction costs. More importantly, they signed a comprehensive property rights agreement acknowledging my environmental buffer zone status and agricultural exemptions. The fountain situation became particularly sweet. Rather than demand its immediate removal, I offered to lease the land for $200 per month, retroactive to the original installation date. That's $12,000 in back payments, plus ongoing revenue that would fund my new project. The county inspector's final report triggered a state-level review of Paradise Pines development compliance. Turns out, Genevieve's systematic destruction of non-conforming landscaping had violated multiple environmental protection requirements that were conditions of their original federal infrastructure grants. The state ordered immediate restoration of all removed vegetation and implementation of new oversight procedures to prevent future violations. Paradise Pines would be under regulatory supervision for 3 years. Carlos received a commendation from the sheriff's office for reporting the sabotage conspiracy, and his company was awarded the contract to restore all the illegally destroyed gardens throughout the community. Justice has a way of rewarding good people. But the real victory was what came next. I used the settlement money to establish the Victory Gardens for Vets program, free landscaping assistance for military families in the community. Within 2 months, we'd helped 8 veteran households create memorial gardens, vegetable plots, and therapeutic outdoor spaces. The container maze itself became an unexpected community asset. I converted the interior courtyard into a memorial garden space where Rodriguez, Smith, and Williams roses could bloom in protected peace. Local scout troops began using it for educational programs about military service and sacrifice. The news coverage had been picked up nationally, turning my story into a symbol of successful resistance against HOA overreach. I started receiving emails from homeowners across the country dealing with similar situations, asking for advice about fighting bureaucratic harassment. Dorothy convinced me to start a monthly workshop called Know Your Rights Property Law for Homeowners. We meet in the community center that once hosted Genevieve's failed rally against me. The irony never gets old. The agricultural exemption I'd discovered led to a community-wide urban farming initiative. 6 families now maintain productive gardens that qualify for similar protections, making future landscape harassment much more difficult for any HOA board to pursue. Most importantly, the new board implemented transparent procedures requiring written notification and appeal processes before any architectural decisions affecting individual properties. No more surprise chainsaws, no more midnight policy changes. Genevieve's real estate career in Paradise Pines ended along with her HOA position. Last I heard, she'd moved to another state where her particular brand of suburban authoritarianism might be less thoroughly documented. My container fortress stands as a permanent reminder that sometimes the best defense against petty tyranny is good engineering, better documentation, and the patience to let your enemies defeat themselves. Every morning I still sit on my front porch with coffee, listening to the satisfying hum of my irrigation system, watering the memorial roses. The difference is that now I'm not just healing from the past, I'm building a better future for military families who served our country and deserve to live in peace. The victory belongs to all of us who refuse to let bureaucratic bullies define our lives. Got your own HOA nightmare story? Drop it in the comments. After what we accomplished in Paradise Pines, I might have a solution for you too. And hit that subscribe button for more David versus Goliath property battles where the little guy wins big. Sometimes justice is a dish best served rusty.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.